Welcome to Maine Policy Pours, everyone. It's nice to see everybody's face. Looks like we got a pretty full room here right now, so these things are doing quite well, and we really enjoy putting on this virtual event to try to get you through your quarantine, which will now last indefinitely for the rest of your lives. So we have plenty of things to talk about, clearly, in terms of what's been going on with state government and Janet Mills' response to the coronavirus situation. So just to give you a quick overview of how today's event is going to go, it's really our desire and it's our attempt to make this a true community happy hour type event. So we're going to go through some stuff from our perspective and talk a little bit about what we're working on and some of the things that we care about and that we see happening in state government. But I would love to get your participation. There's so many people who either own businesses or are employees or whatnot that have been affected by governmental decisions and what's actually happening with everything right now, that I want to get not only your stories a little bit, but just your perspective on things. I know that there's a variety of those perspectives on any number of the issues that we'll talk about here today, and I want to get yours. So throughout this, if you're interested in perhaps chiming in, we would be happy to answer any questions you have. So if you have any of those questions, you can certainly send them to the chat room and to Nick, and we can answer them sort of how we've been doing before, which is to just read them and then answer them. But I'd love to see you on camera, to actually get more of a community organization feel to everything here. So if you have your question, just volunteer and Nick will call on you, and we'll have that question asked, and then we'll try to answer it as best we can. And then on top of that, if you have some statements or comments or things you'd like to add in and chime into this, please volunteer. Nick will call on you, and then we'll open up your mic so that you can make a statement. Try to keep it reasonably brief so that we can get through this, in a reasonable amount of time. But overall, we'd love to hear from you is, I guess, my overall point here. So to start things off, though, I want to go around the staff of the Maine Policy Institute and get some thoughts from each of them about kind of where we stand with our response to not only COVID, but where state government sits right now and what's happening. So I'm going to kind of do a little round robin here and go from point to point and get their thoughts and perspectives on things, and we'll chat back and forth a little bit. And while we do that, please feel free to ask questions or volunteer to speak up yourself. And Nick will end up calling on you when we're kind of done with this portion of the event. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense. The only other thing I'll mention before we get going is Nick is going to actually post in our comment section a link to our petition that we are getting signed right now by as many people as humanly possible to reopen the Maine economy. And this is going to be something that we actually deliver to Janet Mills to try to encourage her to think through her plan a little bit more and perhaps revise it in a number of ways to try to reopen the economy and stop the utter destruction that's happening around us. So if you want to sign that, you haven't done it yet, please do. The link will be in the comment section, and that's a good way of kicking things off. So Nick, I'd like to start with you. Nick, by the way, is now our newest policy analyst at the Maine Policy Institute. So everybody send out a congratulations to Nick for sliding into that role. He's going to do a great job with it. Nick, from your perspective, you just saw the order come through and the plan and the vision and all the things you've seen out of the Mills administration. You want to break down for us a little bit about what you see when you see that order?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Cheers. Maine Policy Pours. We're glad to have everyone here. And so we listened to Governor Mills outline her plan for her phased reopening of the Maine economy. And so, listening to it, she started off by saying that she would eliminate the essential and non-essential business designation, which I think has been a point of frustration for a lot of business owners, because I'm sure we can all think of folks that we know, families that we know, where their job, their business that they work for, that they own, is absolutely essential to their family, protecting their family's livelihood and their health. So, it was good to hear that. But then she starts in this phased reopening where a bit arbitrarily she defines certain areas of society to open. So it begins next month, June 1st, where some businesses are able to open, but the state is rolling out this checklist where they have to show that they're performing certain sanitation measures, they're employing certain health measures. But then the Department of Economic and Community Development, they establish a criteria and they go around and they approve these businesses piecemeal one by one, at least based on what she's laid out yesterday. We're still waiting for more details, obviously, because it really doesn't put down any sort of numbers on hospitalizations, goals for hospitalizations, new cases, testing, and all that. They want to get a lot of tests out, but they don't necessarily say, when do we hit this gate to go to stage 1, or when do we hit this gate to go to stage 2? It's basically kind of on a calendar basis, but obviously it's all subject to change. So at first they allow some more.
Well, Nick, if you don't mind me interrupting here a little bit, if that's okay with you, the thing that strikes me when I'm looking at it is, I mean, in her plan and in her order, everything that she states as metrics that is going to be used for her decision making on whether or not to progress from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, they all are filled with vague language and non-specific language. There's no benchmarks, as you just kind of were highlighting yourself, that would say, like, when we reach X, we feel comfortable doing. She used language like, for instance, the number of flu-like cases, COVID-like cases going down over time. She didn't say how much time, how much it goes down, whether or not spikes up and down are going to be factored into it. She's just trying to sound like she has a plan without providing the details that would be necessary to hold her to account for that plan. And that's the thing that's really the most concerning for me. Outside of the rank hypocrisy of how she's actually kind of grouped some of these things. Nick, I know that looking at the list of like when things go on, you've got May 1st as a deadline, June 1st as a deadline, July 1st as a deadline for different groups of people being able to open up. And there's some bewildering contradictions inside that, is there not?
Absolutely. For instance, stage 2 restaurants can open. That's tentatively June 1st, but stage 3 bars can open on July 1st. So it remains to be seen what makes you a restaurant versus makes you a bar. If you have both, I don't know if it's a seating arrangement. We don't get those sort of specifics, and that's kind of the issue. And Jake highlighted one of these to me earlier, where stage 3, July 1st, outdoor recreation like chartered boat tours are allowed to carry on. How long do those chartered boat tours or those recreational activities get to plan? How long are they able to plan a run up to start taking bookings or prepare for business? So there's a lot of questions there, and obviously, what if you run a campground and there's no indoor place, there's no chartered trips or anything like that. People can reasonably keep their distance. Why would that not start at the beginning of the summer when obviously Maine relies on a lot of tourists and tourist income? So when those people are starting to enter the state and make plans to come back to the state, for me, and I think for us, we really are concerned about the hospitality industry being able to come back from this. The tourism industry is what's going to pull us out of this, as it does for the Maine economy every year. And so the quicker that we can get those people spinning their gears, taking reservations and planning for the actual busy season, the better off we're going to be to get out of this. So that's something that's really frustrating, seeing that she's not necessarily thinking about how that goes, how that happens, because it needs to be considered.
I saw your question in there about the essential designation from the federal government and whether or not the Mills administration is going to be using any of that or whatnot. One thing, it's a little bit complicated. I think the answer is, but everybody who was able to be open already, so the Home Depots, the Walmarts, the things that were already previously deemed to be essential, are able to stay open. So in that respect, the essential businesses are already approved to stay open. So the non-essential ones are the ones that they'll be doing this piecemeal approach to approving one by one, as far as we understand it. So I hope that answers your question a little bit, but it's not what I would call a systematic approach in the least bit. The other thing to me, when I'm looking at this plan, if you will, to me, it strikes me as something that is intentionally destroying the tourism industry in the state of Maine. And I say intentionally because I think the big lesson we've learned from Janet Mills' approach to all things COVID related in the last several months is that she didn't know what to do. And so she turned to the epidemiologists and the CDC and doctors, people in white coats, and said, what do I do? And they gave her a variety of advice, which is absolutely in keeping with what, a doctor would tell you to do, like, limit contact and do all the social distancing in the world. But the problem is that she's listening to no other advice. There's nothing else that she seems to be taking into account for when she's making decisions about what to do and what not to do in terms of the economy. And the hotel, hospitality, restaurant, everything that has to do with tourism, I think that she's doing what she's doing in terms of like not letting hotels open up until July, for instance. She's doing that to keep people out of the state. She does not want tourists from New York and Connecticut and other states to be coming to Maine this year, because I think she's freaked out that the idea that a lot of people from these more hotspot regions will come in, there will be a spike in cases, and then she'll get blamed for the ultimate management of the whole crisis. So I think she's sacrificing 10% of the Maine economy this year and for the foreseeable future too, because if they don't have a season this year in any appreciable sense, there's no way that they're really going to be able to recover very well next year and into the future. There's going to be a lot of devastation and destruction in the economy because of this kind of thing. Thank you very much, Nick. It was a great overview. We really appreciate you doing that for us. Jake is our communications director. And Jake, I know that you've been running point on a lot of this stuff with our petition and trying to get the counter perspective, if you will, on all of this stuff out into the media and having these conversations in public as much as possible. Just why don't you break down a little bit for us right now what it is not only we're doing, but the hashtag resistance is doing right now. What do you think?
So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you don't need barbershops to reopen quite as badly as I do. But what we've done over the last week, really, or last few days, on Monday, we sent out our list of recommendations to the governor, which really called for giving businesses and individuals flexibility while respecting people's constitutional rights. And when you go over the plan that the governor put forward, that's really not what you see from it. She said all along that she was going to use a science-based approach. If I was a member of Maine's press corps, my first question would be, what element of science tells you that golf courses can't open until May 1st? I think our general approach to this is that if businesses are going to take the necessary health and safety steps, which it's in their best interest to do, they know that they need to protect their employees, they know they need to protect their patrons, and nobody really knows better how to do that than the businesses themselves. Government needs to give them the freedom and the flexibility to do so. So when you look at this kind of phased in approach, I think what you just mentioned a moment ago, Matt, is absolutely correct in that there are probably other considerations playing into that timeline. But if a business owner is going to take the necessary precautions, whether that's their staff wearing face masks, or they're going to limit how many people can even enter the establishment to ensure those social distancing guidelines, our approach is let those people make those decisions instead of government. And one thing in our recommendations that the governor specifically did, as Nick had talked about, they're talking about these COVID-19 prevention checklists, which I was watching some of the press conference earlier, and the commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development seemed to be dodging that question on enforcement. She kept saying, we're going to use it as an educational opportunity. If patrons think that something is unsafe, they could notify us or whatever, and we'll use it as an education tool. But they haven't really talked about what is that enforcement mechanism, what does that enforcement look like? Given the impending budget shortfall that we're going to have here in the state because our economy's been shut down for the last 6 weeks, we really don't have the time, the resources, or the inclination to start going one by one and determining, this business has said they're going to follow the guidelines. We've checked them out. We've made sure they're doing it. And now we're going to give them an official stamp of approval so they can reopen. There's still a lot of vagueness around whether or not that's how they're going to do it. I don't know if they are going to give businesses the leeway. Certainly the way the plan was worded yesterday as it relates to then they'll be allowed to open after they've received that badge. It seems like businesses are going to have to pass muster from the state to be able to do this. So that's really concerning given the impending budget shortfall, the revenue shortfall that we're going to have. And really what we want to see is the state of Maine empower people and not government to lead this response. So the petition that we've established, you can go to mainepolicy.org/reopenme and sign our petition. It's been up for less than 48 hours. We have 1,700 signatures. Please share with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and just let them know, we need Maine's economy to get back to normal as soon as possible. And even if that means, as I mentioned before, limiting how many people are in certain places or what have you, if businesses are willing and able to take those precautions, which they will, because it's in their own best interest, they need to be allowed to make those, to take those steps and implement those rules. So really the posture we're taking isn't oppositional. It is critiquing the governor and really thoroughly going through her approach and seeing whether or not the statements that she's made as it relates to relying on science and a science-based approach are really showed through the plan that she puts forward.
Absolutely, Jake. I remember when we released our document the other day, our recommendations, we outlined some of those principles that you had mentioned. Like we need to trust people. We also need to balance the fact that we have to understand that businesses have to balance their bottom line and their livelihoods and the livelihoods of their employees with the health of their customers and the health of all of those people. So it's really trusting people to make the right decision.
Nick, you're breaking up there. I'm not sure if you can hear me talk.
Sorry about that. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Nick, can you hear me right now, Nick?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry. You were breaking up a little bit, but I know what he was getting at, basically. I know, Nick, you had mentioned a moment ago to me in chat that there was a couple questions that we wanted to go to from the audience. So this is a great time to remind everybody that if you have a question, you can raise your hand in Zoom. I'm not sure if you know how to do that, but there's a little tool there that you can actually raise your hand to ask a question, or you can just go in the chat and you can say, hey, I have a question. I'd love to ask it. So Nick, who's the first one up?
Well, I saw Mr. Dave Wallstatt raise his hand out there, and I saw him type his question in. But Mr. Wallstatt, you're unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, I'd like to ask Jacob, do you get any sense that anybody in the media in Maine is interested in asking the types of questions you're asking? Whether this makes sense, whether there's science to back it up? I don't get a sense that there's anybody in the national media or the state media.
Yeah, what I'll say to that is that as I prefaced before, if I was a member of the Maine Press Corps, I would be asking different questions. I think a lot of what's been asked are kind of softballs, quite frankly. I think we need to drill down to what is the science behind some of these decisions. What element of science says that this business should open on this date? Another thing that I think is really interesting that I haven't heard the press on, although I have to be honest that I didn't listen to all of the questions this afternoon, but I did yesterday, and the governor caught a lot of flack last week when she said, here are my general guidelines for reopening the economy, but didn't have a plan or a timeline. In doing so, she created this portal on the Department of Economic and Community Development website for people, individuals, concerned citizens, and businesses to submit their comments to the administration for them to consider in rolling out this plan. So in about 72 hours, they roll out a new plan, 96 hours, whatever it was, roll out a new plan, and they mentioned that 1,600 people and businesses utilized that contact form as a way to submit their comment and opinions to the governor, but we really have no way of knowing, what was the general sentiment of businesses that submitted comment via that portal, and how did their comments factor into your decision making? I think when you're responding to something like this, as Nick mentioned before, you need a measured approach, and it seems like there's a lot of weight being put on the public health side of things right now. And not a lot on the economic and social costs of the quarantine that we're currently in. So I think there is more the Maine media could do to press the governor and her staff on what is the science-based approach here, and how do we get things back up and running in a way that is more workable than the plan that she put forward yesterday.
Hey, Jacob, John Courtney here, if I could just take it a step further. The legislature sent her a letter asking some questions with regards to the Department of Labor, and she actually had the audacity to send the legislature a letter back and suggest that they put their comments on how to reopen the state through that same portal. And basically, I think their little honeymoon with the legislature is over, not only with the Republicans, which has been fun for a long time, but the Democrats are mad as hell. So this is going to get really hot.
That's some good intel, John. Thanks for chiming in on that. And yeah, that's another thing that I've heard from lawmakers, which Mike can probably talk a little bit more about as well. But I know a lot of lawmakers were not thrilled with the fact that they were directed to that same portal.
All right, so as I said, you can raise your hand here and we'll go call on some folks. You can even do this if you want to. We'll probably see you. Trey, I saw your virtual and your physical hand raised. So Trey Stewart, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we go to him next?
Hey, thanks so much, Matt. I appreciate it a lot. And, thank you very much to all the folks at Maine Policy for having us and coordinating this event, this series of events, which I think is critical now more than ever. Because as the previous, I think it was Dave who just mentioned that, the press really isn't doing their job at times like this. And so it's critical to have organizations like yours not be afraid to enter the fray and share as much information as possible. I mean, knowledge is power, right? I think everybody agrees with that. So what's the harm with sharing all of the details, right? Instead of the ones that fit your political narrative. But and to John's point earlier, as a legislator, I can tell you, very frustrated to say the least. I mean, I've got some other choice words, but I won't share them. What the governor's doing right now, and basically relegating the 186 legislators, including members of her own party, let alone the Republicans, which she clearly doesn't care at all about, is just it's completely. It completely goes against the good faith effort that we placed in her when we adjourned on March 17th, that she would keep us informed. We've had just one opportunity to speak to the governor as Republicans, and that lasted for less than half an hour. And she hardly told us anything new. And so if you folks are frustrated as members of the public that have legitimate concerns, believe me, that frustration is shared with the legislature. It's a tough, and so let me segue into my question here, because it's a tricky balance where she's obviously exercised her emergency authority, right? As the governor, she's declared a state of emergency, and she has implemented, pursuant to that, a number of policies that, it really sounds reminiscent of when Obama said, well, I don't need Congress. I'm going to make the laws with a pen and a phone, right? And that's sort of the approach that she's taken here as well, except she's not using the phone to call the members of the legislative branch. So the question is, and we're seeing this play out somewhat in Chicago. There was a case that made it up to the federal court in Chicago. I'm sure it's going to be appealed. No idea what that result is, but the question is, what are you folks seeing over at Maine Policy in terms of any sort of constitutional challenges to these executive orders that might be a way to sort of provide a little bit of pushback? I've seen some traction in terms of telling folks from away that you can't come to your own property that you own, but really nothing beyond that. So am I missing anything as a legislator in that regard?
Thanks for the question, Trey. I'll take this one if you guys don't mind. This is a guy, I'm going to be super cliche, but this is uncharted territory.
Yeah.
So there's not a hell of a lot of case law that really exists in this space, because this kind of thing doesn't happen very often. And when it does, there's a variety of challenges that do or do not make their way all the way up the appellate level to the top. I know that groups like ours across the country right now, the Maine Policy Institute at every state, and there's an umbrella organization known as State Policy Network that works to coordinate our efforts across the country. So, particularly some of the larger ones are trying to find something to sue over. The trick is that the courts have given broad latitude and a lot of authority to not only governors, but also municipal officers like mayors and town managers in the past, in the limited case law that does exist for emergencies. The restrictions that really do exist that the court is skeptical about is when the powers that you assume to try to mitigate and deal with an emergency are overly broad. They're not narrowly tailored enough given the thing they're trying to respond to. I happen to think that there is a lot of room in the legal process to challenge the broad stay-at-home order, for instance, that Jana Mills has done, and many other states have done as well, for being overly broad and not narrowly tailored enough to try to deal with this particular situation, given the, you know, the variables of, you know, what age groups are most threatened, and, you know, what exactly the threat of the virus is to what groups. I think you can make a good argument that it's overly broad. And if that's the case, then I think that there could be a potential possibility of trying to sue, but that process would be done by the time this is sort of behind us. This is not something that's going to immediately resolve these issues, you know, like this week, next month, you know, anything like that. It's going to take a while to work its way through the courts. So it will be useful for the next pandemic, but it's not going to be something that in the short term is going to really be able to mitigate a lot of this damage. I think that the key here is, and I see your hand up, Amy, I'll go to you in a second. I think the key here is that in the short term, and this is something I want Mike Quattrano to talk about in a moment, the reaction of the general public and sort of the pressure that we put on leaders to make sure that they're balancing the concerns that you have to care about here. You have to balance your concerns between public health and protecting the public from without a doubt, a very bad thing, right? My father-in-law was actually one of the people that tested positive for COVID. He's had it for 3 weeks, and he was in a really tough shape for a good week there. And I mean, I saw it firsthand. It's awful. So I acknowledge that, and I acknowledge the public health necessity of trying to do something about it. But trying to balance that with the economic reality that you're creating by doing this the way that we're doing it, and the lack of sense that things, you know, the things make when you leave Home Depot open, but you have a flooring store that's, you know, half a mile down the road that's not able to open for a smaller group of people that's much more easy to contain in terms of protective equipment and whatever else to make sure that the customers that come in are safe. It makes no logical sense, and that kind of thing can be challenged. And I can tell you that whether it's in Maine or other places, it will be challenged. And I think you will see a Supreme Court decision on some of these types of powers coming up, you know, in the summer or in the fall or, you know, some point this year. But it's not going to be something that is immediate for us, I don't think. Amy, you had your hand up. I don't know if you want a question or a comment, but happy to go to you.
Sure. So 2 things. One thing I just wanted to clarify, my earlier question wasn't exactly answered because industrial manufacturing was included in the federal listing of essential services. So we have remained open, and bulk packaging has no intention of closing or pursuing a special sticker for our door. But I mean, we'd be happy to go through the litany. And Matt, I told you at the beginning of this, some of the things that we've done to keep our workers safe. And we have not had anybody test positive so far, despite many people, you know, going out, getting tests and coming back. So that's one thing. But what about, I think that at some point I've heard our president say that he would somehow deal with heavy-handed governors who are taking things too far. And so a number of us have already submitted requests to the Justice Department to have this investigated in some way by them. Is that realistic in any way? I mean, you know, it would seem to me there could be a federal judge that if someone sued in federal court could put a stay on some of her restrictions.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question, Amy. And I'm gonna do something that I don't like doing here very often, and I'm gonna punt on that because I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't really give you a good evaluation of whether or not that's gonna be highly successful or not. As we all know, when the Trump administration says things like that, sometimes it's gold and sometimes it's not. I think that they'll absolutely look into it and they'll try to find every legal to try to do what they can. But from my reading of federal law, I think they're pretty hamstrung by federalism to be able to actually force governors to do X, Y, or Z in these instances. They can probably force them to do additional restrictions, but forcing them to take them off, I'm not sure exactly the mechanics of how that would happen. But I do have good news for you and everybody else who is curious about this, because we actually are going to be doing a legal town hall coming up. It'll be an event very similar to this, a Zoom meeting, and we have 3 fantastic attorneys lined up to give you the legal response to a lot of these questions. So what Trey asked, what you just asked, Amy, can be answered by someone with far more qualifications than me And that's going to be upcoming probably within the next week or 2 weeks at the most. We're going to try to set that up almost immediately. So look out for an email for that, and hopefully you guys will enjoy that event as much as you're hopefully enjoying this one. But I think a lot of those answers would be contained in that kind of town hall for you. Nick, I wasn't paying attention. Any other questions that had been come through? I know actually we had one, DL Pro. I can't see you because you're too small there, and that's the name that I have listed here. I'm not sure who that is, but you actually had your hand up for a question. So.
Well, good afternoon. It's David Printy from
Oh, hey, Print. Hey, Dave.
Hey, Matt, that's okay.
It's hard to see because you're so small on my screen
Well,
right
I'm
now.
actually so far away from you. I'm actually in another state that is in a far more challenging situation than Maine. And I run large medical practices and surgery, and we're conducting surgeries and seeing patients safely. So it really baffles me that Maine is just not in a difficult place. And I'll just share with you, and this is amateur psychologist, but I had a couple of our doctors observed Governor Mills at her news conference, and they would support your conclusion that she really doesn't know what to do, and she's very troubled, and she's very stressed. And it's really sad because that condition is actually hurting our state. So the thing that I'm curious about, and I've tried so hard, I cannot get the opposition party leaders to stand up and offer an alternative program that makes sense, that we can in fact protect everyone. I do at our office every day. We all have our temperatures, we wear masks, we hand sanitize, our patients come in, they have to wear masks, they hand sanitize, they go through their procedures, we test people. And so we really can operate. And if you can go to Hannaford's, you're telling me you can't go to Rennie's? So none of this is logical. And I think I just don't understand why the Republican leadership in both the House and Senate can't stand up and offer an alternative way forward at this point in time. This is political warfare. And I have to tell you, before this started, we had 30% of Maine's hospitals were at risk of actually failing, 30%. And you know, there's a couple hospitals announced today or yesterday that they're going to have to close their doors June 1st because there's no patients. Miles, Lincoln Health in Damascotta has no patients. There's nobody in the hospital. And so my question is, why can't the opposition party leaders get together and stand up and call a news conference and say, this is a more logical way forward. We're concerned about your health. This is what we'll do, but our businesses need to open. I just don't understand. If you saw the email responses I got, they were incredibly disappointing. They said, well, tomorrow we may have to work with the opposition in getting bills passed. I just don't comprehend this.
Yeah, actually, to answer your question, I think this might be a good time to toss things over to one of my other compatriots on our panel here that hasn't had a chance to talk yet. Mike Quatrano is our Director of Civic Engagement, and his life is essentially lobbying the legislature and getting involved with trying to help pass good ideas and stop bad ideas. So I'd love to get Mike's perspective on the answer to this question. And I know that we do have some legislators that are on as well who might be able to add focus to this as well. Trey's waving his hand again. So Mike, let me go to you on this one. And before I do go to Mike, in terms of the questions as we continue to go on, let's just try to make sure that we keep them truncated so we can get to as many as possible, because I don't want to leave anybody on the sidelines. And I know there's a few people that are waiting to ask. So Mike, go ahead.
David, to give you the quick answer, I think that the opposition leadership is just as shocked as everyone else is what she released yesterday. I think they were left in the dark and they're trying to play politics. I talked to a lot of people, and you know what they want? They want her to sign their bills when they come on her desk. That's what they want. Okay, so you're not going to find them pushing back against her. To be honest with you, they're not. Okay. And I can go back, I can give you many examples. A quick one is the Senate president passed a ranked choice voting bill for presidential elections, and he went rogue. So there's a little bit of friction there, and she dictates to them. She doesn't want to have any public vetoes, so there has to be any friction in the public to see that there's any infighting or outfighting on their side. So that's why you're not going to see a press conference with them offering an alternative. And I can tell you, it's our conservative friends in there right now trying to go to bat for small business and try to go to bat for the restaurants and the hospitality industry. No one's fighting for these small businesses right now, except for our friends in there right now. $12 an hour minimum wage, banning plastic bags, which we got back during the emergency, banning styrofoam packaging. The assault on small business has been going on under this whole legislature, and now they're getting stuffed into oblivion. So I'm just going to quickly transition to what I see. I'd be very curious to see when a group as large as 151 House members can get together. I don't know where that falls in on her phased plan. But once that happens, it can't be business as usual, okay? They can't just give us new green deals and Medicaid for all and keep assaulting the little guy and assaulting the small businesses. They can't do that. They need to get in there, and one of the first things they got to do in this legislature, no punting to the 130th, that is no punting till after the election. In this legislature, all these departments need to make cuts. The money ain't coming. She spent almost an extra $1 billion she really didn't have. Now they're kind of, Monday morning quarterbacking themselves. So I think it's on.
Well, the thing about that, Mike, is that they don't have a choice.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to have new revenue projections, and they're going to have a shortfall of what I think is probably going to be $350 billion, million dollars, excuse me. And so that means that whether they like it or not, they have to do that, right? It's not even a matter of just good politics. They have no choice.
But I can tell you, the Department of Labor, no one knows what's going on over there. They're saying on Friday that these independent business owners can apply. I can't tell you how many people I have talked to. I'm sure many people on this virtual town hall. No one can get through. It's busy. You call, they automatically hang up. We're going on a month now that they've had essentially, from what I'm hearing, sitting on $4 million. They've hired 100 people. God bless them. They open 3 extra hours a day. My God, thanks for the sacrifice. I tell you, it's on what I am focusing on. If and when the legislature comes back in, it needs to be quick. It needs to be some hard decisions. We can't keep the attack on the everyday taxpayer and the small business. We need to make these cuts. And I think the leadership, back to David's question, it isn't going to come from the opposition party leadership, as he said. It's going to come from us, like-minded individuals, and we got to keep contacting our elected officials. Give them the support that they need. Let them know that you're there, you got your back. There's a big groundswell. I think a lot of people were very disappointed about extending beyond Memorial Day, which I think is, we're going beyond a place of no return when you go by that weekend, which can make or break a lot of small businesses. I don't want to take up too much time, but I hope, David, I asked your question, and feel free to call back on me. Thanks.
I think this would be a good time to remind everyone that we have a petition that actually is seeking to put pressure on the Mills administration. If you haven't signed it already, you can get it on mainepolicy.org, but we also have a link that Nick is going to put in the chat room if you want to go on there to make that happen as well. The only other thing I'll add to what Mike said is twofold. Number one of the reasons you haven't seen a lot of that stuff out of the opposition side in the legislature so far is that whether we want to admit it or not, it is tough to talk about this in a way that doesn't have gigantic blowback. And it was tougher 2 weeks ago, even last week, than it is today. In the beginning stages of this, everybody in the States was obsessed with not only the COVID numbers and whatnot, but making sure that everybody was healthy and safe and that we weren't spreading the disease too far and we didn't have too many people die. And so the tolerance level for people kind of, moaning about the economy, as legitimate as that complaint was tough to pull off without being ignored and outright, just dismissed. So now that we've gotten into a month and a half of this, and people are starting to really feel the effect, the other side, the social costs of this, you're starting to see people have a lot more comfort in actually standing up a little bit more and being louder about this kind of thing. So I think you're going to start to see a heck of a lot more than you have seen thus far. And the only other thing I'll mention is that they're not in session now. That makes everything hard. I mean, they can have a press conference, which about one newspaper and maybe a TV station might show up for, right? But outside of that, they can't like force legislation, use bargaining chips, and do a lot of the things you would ordinarily as an opposition party to try to do that kind of thing. So it's a tough place to be. It is a tough place to be.
Hey, Matt, I'm thinking we can take another question, but I wanted to let folks know about our raffle that we're holding.
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Nick.
So we have an Amazon gift card for $25. For folks that are here today, we want to put you in that raffle. So please send an email to Heather, that's hnoyes, HNOYES, @mainepolicy.org. And with your name, your phone number, and your mailing address, so we can get that out to you. We'll enter you in that raffle, and we'll let you know who won, and we'll mail it out to you. So that's send an email to HNOYES @mainepolicy.org. Your name, your phone number, your mailing address, and we'll enter you in that raffle. But Matt, I know Richard Hobby has been waiting patiently to ask his question, so maybe we can bring him on.
Absolutely, Richard.
Yes, thanks. This is a fascinating conversation. Just two related points. Don't believe the numbers you're hearing in the media internationally and nationally about the deaths. People, as Candace Owens has pointed out, people who die and they have test positive for the coronavirus. They're listed as having died because of the coronavirus. One example dramatically was a little girl was unfortunately suffocated by her mother accidentally. She tested positive. She did not die of the virus. She died because she was suffocated accidentally, but she's listed as having died from the virus. There's also economic incentives because of this. If you use a ventilator, the hospital will get $3,000. If it's a virus, you'll get more money. And if you want to look at the real science, only people with already pre-existing conditions, for the most part, are dying from this. It's no more dangerous than the flu. And I've been reading a lot of scientific data on this, particularly David Crow up in Canada. And I've listed in the chat area his website, and it will show pretty conclusively, at least by my reading, that this is no more dangerous than the flu. And this is a panic that's been milked and manufactured for either out of ignorance or for political gain to actually hurt the economy and hurt Trump. So there's some thoughts. I'd be interested in people's reactions to that.
Yeah, I appreciate you sending along those things to read. More information is always best. And one of the things that struck me, I don't know if I probably would disagree a little bit about how much we should perhaps take it seriously. I think that a lot of what you just said is correct. But it is a new strain of a new virus that we've never seen before that is running through, and whether it's as deadly as the flu or more, it's something that wasn't there yesterday. So it's something to care about. But I think one of the things that's really that stands out to me about this whole crisis is the fact that we have no idea how deadly it really is. We have no idea about, actually a lot of things about it. We have some general sense of how contagious it is. But in terms of how many people who get it end up passing away, those numbers are not going to be truly known until probably next year, when we can in retrospect look back and we have a lot more data to look at, because you're seeing over and over and over again right now. They test everybody at a homeless facility or in a assisted living facility or in any area where a lot of people congregate, and they have to be in close quarters and there's no real choice. They're coming back with like 150 positive tests and nobody has any symptoms. So clearly it's running through the population more than we know it is. Right now we have, I think something in the neighborhood of 1,100-ish positive tests in the state of Maine, but I think we all know that there's more than that in the state of Maine. And so if it's, 10 times more than that, or 3 times more than that, or twice as much as that, that does affect the overall mortality rate. We just don't know that kind of stuff until later in the game. So we'll have a better picture of this, I think, in retrospect about a year from now. So we'll keep an eye on it. And certainly it really matters with policy. But to me, it just highlights the need to make sure that we're balancing the concern for this new thing with what we're doing to the economy intentionally. Nick, I don't know who was up next. I think I saw Peter and Adia. Did I see your hand go up, or were you just waving at us?
He actually had to go, so he was waving goodbye.
Oh, he's waving goodbye. Okay, perfect. So who was?
But so we have Mr. Earl Rugg had raised his hand to ask a question. Mr. Rugg, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good, good. Thank you for putting on this forum and really encourage folks to again get as actively involved as possible. I'm very, very concerned, particularly just focusing on my own clientele in the healthcare business, and particularly hospitals and rural hospitals and hospitals of the underserved. They're in a very bad way right now, and I think we're going to have lots and lots of problems if we don't open up the economy and help these folks get back to business. Obviously, the other aspect is all the businesses here in Maine, and we are friendly with a number of down here in southern Maine and are very, very concerned about their survivability. I'm wondering if there's some way. I know Attorney General Barr indicated that if we thought that there was some constitutional issues that we should bring them up with our local U.S. attorney. I'm wondering if that's been done. From my perspective, I certainly see issues of equal protection or lack thereof. One of the issues that comes up and has been coming up here locally with some of our religious friends and whatnot is the fact that in the governor's announcement yesterday, she was talking about drive-in religious services, but doesn't mention anything after the 1st of June. So we're wondering what's going on with that, and particularly, why you can go into a liquor store or buy a lottery ticket, but you can't go to mass. So those are some issues that are very, very concerning to people and whatnot. So thanks very much again, and look forward to your comments.
Thanks. We really appreciate that, Earl. I think the question about sort of what's being referred to U.S. attorneys and whatnot is better handled by that legal town hall that I mentioned. I do know that there's enough of us out there right now that are trying to find ways of mitigating the legal damage to a lot of the curtailments of our constitutionally protected civil rights that people are being sued or about to be sued through this in not only Maine but elsewhere. There's not going to be a shortage of litigation in this regard, in my opinion, in any way. So I think that you'll at least get the courts weighing in on it. My fear, though, is that the courts will, as they have in the past many times, sort of side with the government and the compelling government interest to try to mitigate a disease or whatnot, to protect those curtailments that are currently happening now. I don't know that's going to happen, but a reading of previous case law on that says that that's at least a pretty strong possibility, which is sad, unfortunately. But I share your concern. I mean, the curtailment of the right of free exercise of religion, which is a First Amendment protection, among free association, free speech, and any number of other things, is pretty troubling. I know that Jake and I were having an interesting conversation about some of the stuff in there about the protests in Augusta and whether or not this is going to be something that can be even done in the future. There's real concerns about what the governor's new orders and her approach even means for disagreeing with her in public. I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, Jake, but that's another thing that concerns me greatly.
Yeah, it was interesting to see. So I'm sure some people saw in the papers anyway that there was a state representative who had set up a protest that occurred, I think it was sometime last week, on State House grounds. And then he received a letter actually either yesterday or the day before from the Augusta police saying that, you can normally schedule these types of events, but now because the stay-at-home order has been extended, if you have a gathering of more than 200 people, you need to get a permit for that, as you normally would, whether we were in, quarantine, lockdown, shutdown times or not. For a gathering that large, you would need to obtain a permit. Essentially, he was told if he was to schedule another one, he cannot, because the Augusta Police Department will not issue a new permit to do so, because protesting is not an essential business. So despite the Maine Constitution making it very clear that you have this right at all times, I think is the language that appears in the Maine Constitution. There's some real, I guess you could say, sketchy things going on with your constitutional rights, your First Amendment rights specifically, to protest your government and to assemble. So it's a real tricky situation. Obviously, there needs to be a balance, but when you're stuck at home and you're trying to protest the things that are keeping you stuck at home, and then you're being told that you're not allowed to leave your home to protest, that gets into, kind of like Matt said, I don't think there's going to be any shortage of litigation as it relates to this. Maybe not necessarily focused in Maine, but throughout the states as a result of this.
Absolutely. We saw that story of a preacher being arrested in another state early on, and just stories like that are.
Oh, it happened in more than one state. I know there was one in Florida. I believe there was one in Texas.
Right. And
the one that was really troubling to me about that was that at least one of the ones that got arrested was doing in-car services. Like he was holding a mass with everyone in their vehicle, you know, as I mean, that's as socially distanced as you possibly can do, right? You're separated by definitely many feet and your windows, you know, partially up at least. I mean, you're really not a danger to anybody in that kind of situation. Certainly not more than you are when you're in Home Depot buying flooring. So there's huge concerns there, and rightly so, and I think you're going to definitely see litigation. Nick, I know that we had another question coming in, and just as a reminder, we're wrapping up here pretty soon. We only have a few minutes left. So your questions, if they can be truncated and we can go quick, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can before we get out of here.
yes, one more reminder to email Heather at hnoise@mainepolicy.org with your name and address and phone number to get into that raffle for that Amazon gift card. I'm seeing a question from Rogers Plowing. Is that a Mr. Rogers there? I see you're raising your hand, so I'll unmute you there, and please go ahead.
Actually, my name's Joseph Antel, and I spoke with you this morning, Nick.
Oh, yes. Hello.
How
Good to
are
see
you?
you.
Good. I guess I have a couple of questions. One is, did I understand one of our legislators who was here saying that they aren't active right now and they're not participating in the legislature? So we're not getting full participation of our government in any of this decision making. It's just being done by Janet Mills and a little cabal of people. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I think that's the big problem here. I certainly think that the failure to not bring in other voices and other ideas really does not demonstrate to me further interest in resolving an issue that is a great issue to everybody. Everybody's involved and everybody's seriously being hurt. The second thing I have to say is my comment to Nick this morning was that when I looked at the overall plan, what I saw as a plan was really guidelines about controlling the virus, but nothing from an economic standpoint that might have been suggested by people from business who would say that, look, one of the ways that we can improve our economy or develop our economy and back our economy would be to start out on a small basis. I shared this morning with Nick, that rather than try to go into it all at once, why not have a 2 or 3 day work week? That, in my case, when I ran a shoe business, ran a ladies' shoe business for many years, if I was in this situation today, what I would say is that I could open for 3 days. That would give me an opportunity for customers who might want to come to my business to focus on those 3 days, shut down the other 5 days or 4 days, thereby saving some of my costs and expenses, and focusing on a shorter period of time to bring in some income. I mean, my question here is the state going to do anything for people who are being hurt here? Is there going to be some mitigation in terms of taxes that we have to pay and that kind of thing? Well, there's, so where are people supposed to find the money? These are real serious questions that business people are looking at, and they're not going to be able to come up with an answer unless there's going to be some help or some able for the state to say, well, we could step back, we could put this on the back burner, or we could do something to help you with our expenses. And I'm not hearing any of that. And I don't see a real plan for stepping up business back into the state. And that's, I think there are ways to suggest good ideas that could be done. She hasn't done that.
Absolutely. Mr. Antel, you shared with me earlier today that you had owned a shoe business.
Right.
How would you have handled that? having to be closed for 6 weeks to 2 months, and then at the end of those 2 months being told that you need to be closed for another month. But in order to open back up again, you would have to meet the state's criteria and get your badge and everything else. I can't even imagine what goes through a business owner's mind when they're getting this news this week. And so that's why we put in our, that's why we put our document, we put our recommendations that the state needs to be concerned with this. They need to come back to a special session, make permanent all of these regulations that have been suspended, that have not caused any harm. But they also need to disperse some money for families who are homeschooling nowadays, for instance. We need to shore up the state's systems in order to take care of people when it's not working for them right now. That's where we're coming from with our recommendations.
And I think that's true. And I think the other part of what you just said is, if I had to do what she's recommending, it's a burden. It's an additional expense and a terrible burden just to try to keep my business running. I don't know if I'd still be in business if I was out of business for 6 weeks, to be perfectly honest with you.
Okay.
My bills for my inventories and that kind of stuff doesn't stop. My people want to get paid. How do you deal with that when you don't have an income coming in? And I really do think she fails to recognize what a business person goes through. She just doesn't have a clue. She was never a business person as far as I know, and she doesn't have a clue. And the other thing I would say is, certainly I think you guys have a reason to say, what are the secret meetings you have had, Janet Mills? You've had some secret meetings. What's in those? Let's get a little transparency on that. What have you guys discussed? You wanted to know from Governor LePage what he did. Well, we'd like to know what you did.
Yeah, I think so. That's great thoughts. Thank you so much for sharing them. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We might have time for maybe one more, Nick, if there's somebody else that was in line. I don't know if there was anybody else that had a question.
I hadn't seen any other raised hands. Okay. We had folks.
We are basically at 5:30, so we can wrap things up here. I guess maybe to take us home, I haven't introduced to you yet the irrepressible Heather Noyce, who is also obviously an employee at the Maine Policy Institute, and I would love to just toss it over to her for a couple minutes and say thank you for being you, Heather, but also just give us a quick preview and window into sort of organizationally what we're doing right now and how things have changed for nonprofits, because it's an interesting time, is it not?
It is absolutely an interesting time in the fundraising and in the nonprofit world, for sure, especially coupled with the fact that there are so many people in need right now. And when we talk with our supporters and members every day, thank you for taking our phone calls and reading our emails and opening our letters. There is so much excitement isn't the word, and maybe anxiousness is a bit better about the direction of our state and where we're going. But what I hear over and over again from our friends and our supporters is how grateful they are for the work that we're doing. And this is not possible without you. Our fundraising efforts have not stopped. We have been pivoting and doing meetings a little bit differently, but we are on the path to still raising our budget so that we're able to push back against a growing government, an overreaching government, and really trying to provide all the solutions that the governor needs, that her administration needs, that the legislature needs in order to turn this around. So thank you for everything that you do to help us do all of this work. We really appreciate it. And if you want to talk or you need anything, you obviously have my email, my phone, and just thank you for everything.
Don't go away. Great. Thank you, Heather. We really appreciate it. And I want to echo that and say thank you all for not only all the support you've given us, but also for coming to this today. This is actually our most successful virtual happy hour we've done so far. I think we're building a little momentum behind them. And it was really great to hear other voices today and sort of really make this interactive. So I hope you guys join us for not only our upcoming legal town hall, but also our future events that we do this way for our virtual happy hours. Also, I'm pretty sure we're actually going to continue to do this even when we do return to normal. So I hope you find it valuable and interesting, and I really have. So I want to say a quick thank you to everybody for participating. And with that, I think we'll all wave away and see you again next time.
Thank you all.